The West was not won with iron and fire alone. The truest victories are built in the silent spaces between two worlds, forged with courage and understanding. The year was 1882. In the vast, lonely expanse of the Montana Territory, Stone Creek Valley was a pocket of stubborn green carved by the river. For 19-year-old Elizabeth Hoffman, it was a world shrunk by grief. The fever that had swept through the settlements last spring had taken her mother, leaving behind a silence that the prairie wind could not fill. Her days were now a quiet rhythm of tending the herb garden, mending clothes, and assisting her father, Dr. Adam Hoffman. The scent of sage and pine was the only comfort she had left, a constant reminder of a life that felt a world away, yet was only buried on the small hill overlooking their ranch. Her father was a man of science and quiet faith, his hands as skilled at setting a bone as they were at turning the pages of his worn medical journals. "We are all just people, Elizabeth," he often said, his gaze fixed on the distant Cheyenne encampment. "Fear builds walls. Understanding builds bridges." He tended to the ailments of settlers and natives alike, earning a cautious respect from the Cheyenne. But his dream of a peaceful valley was fraying at the edges. Tensions were rising, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated through the very soil of their homestead, a tension that even his calm demeanor could not soothe. The source of that tension had a name: Malcolm Blackwood. A cattle baron whose ambition was as vast as the Montana sky, he wanted the entire valley for his herds. Whispers in the nearby town of Red Creek told of how he used intimidation and force to drive smaller ranchers out. In his shadow rode a man named Griffin, a former lawman with cold eyes and a reputation for doing the dirty work Blackwood would not touch himself. "He is a wolf in sheep's clothing," her father had warned, his voice grave. "And Griffin is his pack." The rumors grew bolder with each passing week, dark clouds gathering on the horizon. That afternoon, the air was still and heavy, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Elizabeth was in her father's study, carefully sorting dried chamomile into glass jars. The sun cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards. A sharp crack echoed from outside, not the familiar report of a hunting rifle, but something harsher, more deliberate. It was the sound of a world breaking. She froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The delicate scent of herbs was suddenly replaced by the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the chilling realization that the storm had finally arrived at their door. The door burst open, and Griffin stood there, framed against the dying light. He was flanked by two rough-looking men, their faces hardened by sun and malice. "The doctor is expecting us," Griffin said, his voice a low growl that held no warmth. Dr. Hoffman stepped in front of his daughter, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "There is no need for this, Griffin. Whatever dispute you have, we can settle it with words." Griffin's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "My employer, Mr. Blackwood, is tired of words. He desires this land to be clean." The threat hung in the air, sharp and clear as glass. The men moved with brutal efficiency. When Dr. Hoffman tried to block their path to Elizabeth, one of the henchmen struck him with the stock of a rifle. He crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading on his shoulder, but his eyes were still open, fixed on his daughter with a look of anguish. Griffin grabbed Elizabeth by the arm, his grip like iron. "You will be a message," he hissed, his breath foul with whiskey. "A message that this valley belongs to Blackwood now. The rest of these homesteaders and the Cheyenne heathens will understand soon enough." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. They dragged her outside, her feet stumbling on the familiar ground. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and orange. One of the men tied her wrists with a rough leather cord that bit into her skin. Griffin mounted his horse, then pulled her up behind him, her body held tight against his. She was not a person to them, but a piece of property, a pawn in a ruthless game for land and power. Her gaze fell upon her father, struggling to rise, his face a mask of helpless fury. She wanted to scream his name, but the sound caught in her throat, a knot of pure terror. As they rode away from the ranch, Griffin turned in his saddle. In his hand, he held a lit torch. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the dry wooden porch of their home. The flames caught instantly, licking at the walls with a hungry roar. Elizabeth watched, her heart shattering as the fire consumed everything. Her mother's rocking chair, her father's library of priceless books, the very walls that had held all her memories. The smoke rose into the twilight sky, a black funeral pyre for the life she had just lost. The journey was a blur of dust, pain, and the harsh laughter of her captors. Griffin's men rode hard, pushing their horses through the rugged country, leaving the civilized world far behind. Elizabeth, daughter of a man of logic, forced her mind to work. She fought against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She studied the landscape, noting the shape of a peculiar rock formation, the way a creek bent to the south, the pattern of the stars at night. She would not be a helpless victim. She would remember the way back. She would survive this. On the second day, she noticed a change in the men. They grew quieter, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges around them. Griffin's confident sneer was replaced by a tense, watchful scowl. She did not understand why until she saw the tracks. They were faint, almost invisible to her untrained eye, but Griffin's men saw them, the hoofprints of unshod ponies. "Cheyenne," one of the men muttered, his voice tight with fear. "We are on their hunting grounds," Griffin cursed under his breath. "Ride faster. Blackwood pays us to handle savages, not run from them." Meanwhile, a league to the north, a young Cheyenne war chief named Blackhawk followed the trail of desecration. His scouts had reported the riders who had trespassed on sacred ground, their iron-shod horses scarring the earth. This was the land of his ancestors, a place of power and sustenance for his people, the people of the plains. He was not pursuing mere criminals. He was hunting a sickness that had invaded his home. He did not yet know they held a captive. He only knew that the balance of his world had been disturbed, and it was his duty as chief to restore it. Blackhawk was a hunter of unparalleled skill. He moved with the patience of the hawk for which he was named, his warriors melting into the landscape like shadows. He watched Griffin's party from a high ridge, his expression grim. He saw their fear, their carelessness. They were loud, clumsy, and disrespectful. They did not belong here. He raised a hand, signaling his warriors to spread out, to close the trap. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying a promise of justice. The trespassers would soon learn that these mountains had a protector. Blackhawk's strategy was flawless. He did not charge head-on. Instead, he used the terrain, funneling Griffin's party into a narrow, box canyon from which there was no easy escape. His warriors appeared on the canyon rims as if from thin air, their bows ready, their faces stern and impassive. Blackhawk rode forward alone, his presence commanding, his voice calm and steady. "You trespass on the lands of the Cheyenne," he called out in clear English. "Leave what you have stolen and go. Your lives will be spared." He had not yet seen the woman held captive. Griffin, trapped and cornered, let out a harsh, defiant laugh. "We do not take orders from a savage." He drew a long knife, its blade glinting in the sunlight, and held it to Elizabeth's throat. "This is my ticket out of here. Call off your warriors, or the girl's blood will stain this ground." Blackhawk's eyes narrowed. He saw her then, the fear in her wide blue eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Defiance. He saw the way she held herself, a silent plea not for rescue, but for a chance. The situation had changed. A life was at stake. In that heart-stopping moment, Elizabeth acted. With a sudden, desperate cry, she stomped her foot down hard on the instep of Griffin's boot. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening she needed. She threw her weight sideways, sending them both tumbling from the horse. The sudden chaos was the signal Blackhawk's warriors had been waiting for. Arrows flew, not to injure, but to disarm. They struck rifle barrels and saddlebags, creating confusion and panic among Griffin's men. The fight was over almost before it began. The Cheyenne warriors descended into the canyon, their movements swift and precise. They overpowered Griffin's men, disarming them without causing serious harm. In the confusion, a wounded and enraged Griffin scrambled onto a loose horse and fled the canyon, vanishing like a snake into the rocks. He had lost his prize, but his hatred had only deepened. Elizabeth was left alone, bruised and trembling, in the center of a circle of silent, watchful warriors. Black Hawk dismounted, approaching her slowly. He knew he could not leave her here. To do so would be a sentence of death. The Cheyenne camp was a living, breathing thing, a sprawling collection of painted tipis nestled in a hidden valley. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the clean scent of pine. For Elizabeth, it was like stepping into another world. As Black Hawk led her through the village, every activity ceased. Faces turned to stare, eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and deep-seated mistrust. She was an outsider, a symbol of the very people who were encroaching on their lands, and she felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical burden. The hostility was most palpable from a young woman with fire in her eyes and a warrior's posture. Her name was Fire Arrow, and she made no effort to hide her contempt. She spoke to Black Hawk in the rapid Cheyenne tongue, her gestures sharp and accusatory. Elizabeth did not need to understand the words to feel their sting. This woman saw her as an enemy, a threat to be removed. The stares of the others were merely curious. Fire Arrows was a direct and personal challenge that made Elizabeth's skin prickle with apprehension. Salvation came in the form of an elderly woman whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles and whose eyes held the wisdom of 100 winters. She was called She Who Knows the Ways, the spiritual heart of the tribe. She silenced Fire Arrow with a quiet word and a steady gaze. Then she turned to Elizabeth, studying her not as a white woman, but as a human spirit in turmoil. "The hawk does not bring a mouse into its nest without reason," she said in slow, careful English. "Come, child, you will stay in my lodge." Her voice was a balm to Elizabeth's frayed nerves. Inside the elder's teepee, the air was warm and smelled of sacred herbs. Soft buffalo robes were piled for sitting, and a small fire crackled in the center pit. "You are on a difficult path," She Who Knows the Ways said, handing Elizabeth a cup of warm, minty tea. "Our people have suffered much. Trust does not come easily." Elizabeth clutched the cup, her hands trembling slightly. She looked into the old woman's kind eyes and understood. Her survival here would not be granted. It would have to be earned, stitch by stitch, word by word, through respect and strength of character. The following weeks were a trial of patience and humility. Elizabeth began to learn. She helped the women gather herbs, recognizing many from her father's teachings. One evening, the young son of a warrior fell gravely ill with a fever. The boy's mother was desperate. Remembering her father's methods, Elizabeth prepared a cooling poultice of willow bark and bathed the child's forehead. By morning, the fever had broken. It was a small thing, but whispers of the white woman's healing touch began to spread through the camp, the first seeds of acceptance. She dedicated herself to learning the Cheyenne language, listening intently, repeating words in the privacy of her lodge. Black Hawk's younger brother, a cheerful young man named Swift Deer, became her unofficial teacher. He would point to objects and name them, laughing good-naturedly at her clumsy pronunciation. "You speak like a prairie dog with a mouthful of berries," he teased, but his friendship was a welcome comfort. Through him, she began to understand the rhythms and humor of his people, seeing them not as stoic savages, but as families who loved and laughed, just like her own. Black Hawk watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He saw her diligence, her quiet determination, and the kindness she showed to the children. He found himself seeking her out in the evenings, when the camp gathered around the central fire. Their conversations were hesitant at first, a careful dance between two different worlds. He spoke of his duty to his people, of the encroaching threat of men like Blackwood. She spoke of her father's dream of peace, of a world where different people could live side by side. One night, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, he spoke to her with a new intensity. "My people see a white woman," he said, his deep voice soft, "but I see a spirit as strong as the mountain stone. You have the heart of a healer and the courage of a warrior." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. In his dark eyes she saw not just a chief, but a man. And in that moment she realized she was no longer just a captive, but something more. The fragile piece of the valley was about to shatter. Malcolm Blackwood, enraged by Griffin's failure, put a new plan into motion. He began spreading vicious rumors among the settlers in Red Creek. Stories of Cheyenne raids that never happened, of livestock stolen in the night. He painted the tribe as bloodthirsty heathens, a threat that needed to be eliminated. His goal was simple and diabolical: to incite a war and in the ensuing chaos claim the entire valley for himself under the guise of protecting the settlers. Fear, expertly manipulated, became his most potent weapon. At the same time, a new presence arrived in Red Creek. Deputy Marshal Elias Ward, a man with a square jaw and weary, honest eyes, rode into town. He had been sent from the territorial capital with a mandate to investigate claims of land grabbing and unrest. He was a veteran of the plains, a man who knew that truth was often the first casualty in conflicts over land. He listened to Blackwood's blustering accusations with a skeptical ear, his instincts telling him that the real story lay hidden beneath the surface of the cattle baron's righteous anger. Black Hawk's scouts brought him news of the growing trouble. They reported the meetings in Red Creek, the armed men gathering at Blackwood's ranch, the palpable fear among the homesteaders. He also learned of the new lawman. He saw Blackwood's strategy for what it was: a coward's path to war. The raid on the Hoffman Ranch was not an isolated act of banditry. It was the opening move in a chess game where his people were the pawns. A great weight settled upon him. He was now responsible not only for his tribe, but for averting a war that would consume the entire valley. He found Elizabeth by the creek, her gaze distant as she watched the water flow. He told her what his scouts had learned. Her face paled as she understood the scale of Blackwood's treachery. "My father tried to warn them," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "He said men like Blackwood feed on fear." Black Hawk looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the determined set of her jaw. "This is a fight for all of us now," he said. "Your people and mine. Blackwood thinks to divide us, but perhaps together we can show them a different way." The growing tension in the valley was mirrored within the Cheyenne camp. Fire Arrow, fueled by Blackwood's aggressions, saw Elizabeth's continued presence as a weakness. "While she sits by our fire, her people plot our destruction," she declared before the tribal council. "How can we trust a chief who is softened by a white woman's eyes?" Her words were sharp, and they found purchase in the hearts of those who had lost the most. To silence the dissent and prove her own commitment, Elizabeth knew she had to face the challenge head-on. Fire Arrow did not demand a fight with knives, but a challenge of spirit and skill, a test sacred to the Cheyenne. It was a race, a breakneck ride on horseback through the treacherous badlands east of the camp. The course was dangerous, filled with steep ravines and narrow, rocky paths. It was a test not just of speed, but of courage and oneness with the horse. "Let the spirits judge who has the stronger heart," Fire Arrow proclaimed, her challenge echoing through the silent council. Elizabeth, her own heart pounding, looked at Black Hawk, then stood. "I accept." For 3 days, Black Hawk trained her relentlessly. He taught her to read the horse's every twitch, to anticipate the terrain, to become part of the animal beneath her. "Do not fight the path," he instructed, his hands guiding hers on the reins. "Flow with it, like the river flows around the stones." He was a patient teacher, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of anxiety. In those long hours of training, their bond deepened, forged in shared purpose and the quiet language of trust that passed between them. On the day of the race, the entire village gathered. Fire Arrow rode like a spirit of the wind, her movements fluid and fearless. Elizabeth rode with all the courage she could muster, her heart in her throat. She fell behind in the treacherous canyons, but on the long, flat stretches, she pushed her horse with a desperate strength. She did not win. Fire Arrow crossed the finish line a full minute ahead. But as Elizabeth rode in, tired and dust-covered, but not defeated, a murmur of respect went through the crowd. She had not broken. She had faced the challenge with honor. Even Fire Arrow gave her a slow, grudging nod. His patience worn thin, Malcolm Blackwood made his final move. He gathered his hired guns, including a bitter and vengeful Griffin, and rode toward the Cheyenne encampment. He told the terrified townsfolk it was a preemptive strike to end the savage threat once and for all. He intended to provoke a battle, a massacre that would give him the excuse he needed to claim the entire valley. But Black Hawk's scouts had watched his every move. The Cheyenne were not caught unprepared. They were ready for the fight. The defense of the camp was a testament to their newfound unity. Black Hawk commanded the warriors with brilliant tactical skill, using the terrain to his advantage. Elizabeth, putting her father's knowledge of strategy to use, helped organize the camp's defenses, ensuring the women and children were moved to a safe, defensible position in the rocks above the valley floor. She was not a warrior, but she had a keen mind for logistics and planning, a different kind of strength that proved just as vital in the face of the coming attack. Blackwood's men charged into the valley, expecting to find a panicked, disorganized camp. Instead, they met a disciplined and determined defense. The battle was fierce, a storm of noise and confusion, but the Cheyenne held their ground. Just as their lines began to strain under the sheer numbers of Blackwood's force, a new sound cut through the chaos. A bugle call. From the west, Deputy Marshal Elias Ward appeared, leading a posse of armed homesteaders. They rode not to attack the Cheyenne, but to flank Blackwood's men. The tide turned in an instant. Caught between the Cheyenne warriors and the Marshal's posse, Blackwood's hired guns lost their nerve. Their attack crumbled into a chaotic retreat. Griffin was captured, his fight ending not with a bang, but with the cold steel of the Marshal's handcuffs. Blackwood himself, seeing his plan in ruins, tried to flee but was cornered by Black Hawk and Marshal Ward. "Malcolm Blackwood," the Marshal declared, his voice ringing with authority, "you are under arrest for conspiracy and incitement to violence." The day was won, not by one side, but by an alliance forged in the fire of a common threat. In the aftermath, a great council was held in the shade of the cottonwood trees by the river. It was an unprecedented sight. Cheyenne elders sat across from weary homesteaders. Deputy Marshal Ward stood beside Chief Black Hawk. They spoke of treaties, of boundaries, of mutual respect. They drafted an agreement, a simple document that guaranteed the Cheyenne their sacred hunting grounds and promised a shared defense of the valley against any future threats. The air, once thick with suspicion, was now clear with the promise of a lasting peace. Elizabeth was the heart of it all. Moving between the two groups, she translated not just words, but ideas and feelings. She explained the Cheyenne's deep connection to the land, to the settlers. She conveyed the homesteaders' desire for a safe home for their families to the Cheyenne Council. She had earned the trust of both sides, and her voice became the bridge that spanned the chasm of fear and misunderstanding. In her, they all saw the possibility of a shared future, a future they would have to build together. Her wedding to Black Hawk was the first act of that new future. It was a ceremony of two worlds. She wore a dress of soft white doeskin, intricately beaded by the Cheyenne women, but cut in a style that honored her own heritage. A Cheyenne blessing was followed by a reading from her mother's Bible, performed by a humbled homesteader. It was a symbol for all to see, a powerful declaration that two different paths could merge into one, stronger river, destined to flow onward together into a new and uncharted landscape. Years later, a new town named Hope Creek thrived where the valley opened to the plains. It was a place where settler wagons parked next to Cheyenne teepees, where children of all shades played together by the river. Elizabeth and Black Hawk would often stand on the hill overlooking the town, their own children playing at their feet. The story of the doctor's daughter who became a chief's wife was told around campfires and in cozy cabins, a legend of the valley. It was a story of how courage, respect, and love could forge a lasting peace, proving that even in the wild heart of the West, the strongest bridges are built by hand.